Hello everybody, how's it going? Today we're going to talk about decoupled lambdas using SNS. On my first video, I showed how you can create a step function to orchestrate multiple lambdas into workflow steps. Well, sometimes you don't need a full set of lambdas in the step function, but you still want to have two separate lambdas for two completely different codes. You could just call a lambda from another lambda, right? Wrong! Don't do that. It's a bad design. Not only your application will be tied together, but also you will be charged twice, where your calling lambda will be waiting for the receiver lambda execution. A much better approach is to decouple your application using SNS. You can use that to call another lambda without having to wait for it to execute. Or a lambda that could run a batch job that's going to take some time, or it can trigger a step function, or maybe it's going to call a lambda that another team is managing. So it's a good separation of the teamwork. You can even put an SQS between the SNS and the second lambda so you can control the flow execution. So many possibilities! On this example, we are going to create two separate lambdas where the first one is going to trigger the second one using the SNS. No worries, it's super easy. Let's do it right now. Folder here, and I put two empty lambdas. One's going to be the first one that's going to send the message to SNS, and then the second is going to receive the message from SNS. So let's start with lambda 1. I'm going to add some import here, and then I will need context, encoding JSON, and all these other ones. And for the lambdas, I will need the lambda SDK, the session, and the SNS. Let's just consider we're going to have 4 parameters. Now let's create our main function. And this is going to call the HandleRequest. So let's create it. The HandleRequest is going to receive the context and the input, which is going to be our struct. Let's print the input. Now let's marshal it so we can pass this as a string to our SNS. So we're converting the input into array of bytes. Now let's call a function that's going to send the SNS message. Let's call it SendSNS. We're going to get from the environment the SNS ARN to whom you're going to send the message to. And we're converting this array of bytes to a string. Now let's just return OK. And before we define our SNS function, let's just update some parameters for the parameter 3 and parameter 4. So we make sure that this was updated by our lambda, and then our parameter 4 is going to be hi mommy. So we make sure that the parameter 1 and 2 are kept as is, and the 3 and 4 are updated within this message. Now let's define our SendSNS message. Okay, so this is a sample of ARN of an SNS. So if you can see here, the 4th parameter is the region. So to make this function more generic, we can get the region from here and create the session, the AWS session, from this region specifically. So I'm getting here the 4th parameter, setting it the variable as a region. So now let's instantiate the session. Let's print some log here. Now we need to create an object to pass to the SNS function. And it is expecting a topic ARN and the message from this SNS publish struct. Now we can just call the publish method from our SNS object here. Let's do some error validation. And another log just to see the response. Okay, that's pretty much it. So now let's go to our lambda number 2. So let's add the import. I will need the context, also the encoding JSON, and for the lambda events, I will need the events and the lambda SDK. Let's create the main function, and I'm gonna call my handle SNS. My handle SNS function will receive an event directly from the struct that AWS provides. And this event here contains a list of records. So let's look through those records. And for this record here that we receive, let's just marshal it to a string so we can see in the logs. And now, because we're receiving a message that's going to be the same structure as this, so let's just copy this over here. And we're gonna, from this message here, we're gonna unmarshal it to this struct object. So let's create an empty struct, and then we unmarshal it. And what we are unmarshaling here is that exact record that we're looking through, .sns.message. This is where is the location of your message inside the struct of the SNS event. When we're going to run this, you're going to see the whole struct, and then it's going to be easier to understand why we're getting this exact location here. So now let's just print the parameters. This is parameter 1, so let's print all of them. Let's now create the Terraform. Let's create a new folder here for the Terraform. And let's create a new file called, I don't know, main.tf. Oops. Okay, there we go. Of our provider. And then let's create the lambdas. Okay, first thing, let's put the compilation of the code inside here. So yeah, as you've seen in my previous videos, this is how you can compile the code and then generate the binaries for Linux so we can deploy it to AWS. So I'm gonna compile the lambda 1 and put the target in the target folder, and I'm gonna call this binary as lambda 1 bin. And I'm also gonna compile my second lambda to a different binary. Just because they're both in the same package folder, so I cannot compile them together. And also you need two different binaries for the two different lambdas. So this should compile the code. Now let's zip it. So I'm just zipping my target folder where I drop those binary files, and I'm gonna put the output path of my zip, the same location, and it depends on my compilation. Now let's deploy the first lambda. So I'm just calling it Flavio lambda 1. My handler is my binary file name. My role is this one, but of course you need to update your role with your correct role that you've created. If you don't know how to do it, in my first video I explained exactly how to set up your environment and creating your roles in AWS. And also, if you remember, I'm reading the ARN of my SNS, and then I'm passing it here, and I just need to provide the SNS of the the ARN of the SNS. So I'm going to create that really soon. So let's deploy the lambda, the second lambda. So it's going to be exactly the same. I'm just replacing the 1 with 2. And for this one, I don't need this environment stuff because I'm not going to read that. Just going to receive the message from that SNS. So now let's create an SNS. To create an SNS in Terraform is extremely simple. You just need to put AWS SNS topic and then the name of it. So I'm just calling it SNS bridge, and this is exactly where I am referencing it here. So I'm using this as an environment variable for my first lambda. But we need more stuff. We need to add a permission so our lambda can be triggered from the SNS. So you need this AWS Lambda permission, allow execution from SNS, invoke Lambda, and then this is going to be for my second Lambda. So what's going to happen is my first Lambda is going to send a message to the SNS, and then the SNS it's going to trigger and invoke this second Lambda. So you need to add a permission for that. And now that I have a permission, I can just subscribe my second lambda to this SNS topic here. So AWS SNS topic subscription, the protocol is lambda, and then my endpoint is my second lambda, and the topic ARN is the SNS I just created. And now that I have everything set up, I'm just going to output something here that's going to show the flow. It's kind of a little architecture flow diagram or whatever you want to call it. So the lambda 1 ARN is going to send message to the SNS bridge ARN, which is going to invoke my second lambda ARN here. So it's nice to have like the ARNs of the flow. So once you run Terraform, you can see the ARNs in case you want to debug or see the logs. So it's just a little bit easier when you deploy to have all those ARNs handy. So now let's try to deploy this and see how it goes. Okay, I am here inside my projects folder. I'm going to my Terraform folder, and now I'm just going to do Terraform init. And this is the version that I'm using. Now I'm going to do apply. Okay, everything is deployed. So remember that output architecture that I created. So my lambda 1 is going to send the message to the SNS bridge topic, which is going to send a message, well, it's going to be consumed by the second lambda. So let's go to AWS console. Let's go to lambda. Yep, lambda 1, lambda 2, just deployed. Let's go to the SNS. Topics, yeah, the SNS bridge is created. It's a standard type. There are different types of SNS, but let's go with the standard one for now. And now let's go to our lambda 1. Click on test. Let's use the UI to test this. Param1, param2. Let's remove the rest. And then save changes. Then hit test. Okay, execution succeeded, so it returned OK as we're expecting. These are the logs. So if you remember, it's just printing the input, which is just the value 1 and 2, and then sending the message to this SNS bridge, SNS topic, and this is the message. So I kept my 2 parameters, if you remember, and then I added my parameter 3 and parameter 4 to my message, and this is sent to the SNS bridge, and this is the message ID was generated. So now let's go to the second lambda and check the logs. Monitor, view in CloudWatch. Okay, let's check the latest one. So this is what it was print. So this is the structure of the whole input of the SNS. So basically it's records, and then inside the records you could receive more than one message at a time. So we're parsing through those messages. So if you remember in here, though we were looping through it, so our event has the list of records, and then for that specific record we're looking at the SNS and message. So we have the records, the SNS inside, and our message is inside here, which is a string, right? It could be anything, any string, but inside this string we put our JSON message. So we unmarshal this message into the structure that we're expecting, which is just parameter 1 to 4, and we're printing the values in here. And now looks good. Okay, so this is how you can decouple the two lambdas and connect them using SNS events. Thanks for watching.